Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Everyday Health Stories, the podcast where we explore the fascinating world of medical science through the power of storytelling. I'm Anna, and with me is Dr. Reddy. Dr. Reddy has a gift for making the complex world of health understandable. He's here to break down the ins and outs of the human body, from medical conditions to nutrition, all in a way that's simple and easy to follow.
Thanks, Anna. I'm really excited about today's episode because we're tackling a topic that everyone can relate to, the complicated relationship between hunger, cravings, and weight gain.
Oh my gosh, this is such an important topic. I know so many people who struggle with understanding the difference between actual hunger and just, wanting to eat.
And that's precisely why we need to talk about this. We're going to break down the science behind three key concepts: hunger, cravings, and addiction, and how they're connected to two really important hormones in our body.
Before we begin, please take a moment to hit pause and subscribe to the podcast. You'll get notified of new episodes, gain access to exclusive content, and join a community that's making positive changes, one story at a time.
And today, we're also going to share a fascinating case study that, it really illustrates how these concepts play out in real life. We'll even talk about how grizzly bears, believe it or not, can help us understand our own metabolism better.
Dr. Reddy, let's start with these three key concepts: hunger, craving, and addiction. How do we tell them apart?
This is such a crucial distinction to understand. Real hunger is actually your body's legitimate need for nutrients. It comes on gradually, and you'll feel physical signals like a growling stomach or maybe even a slight headache.
Oh, that's so interesting. I always thought hunger was just feeling like eating something.
Right, but that's where cravings come in. See, cravings are different. They're more like sudden urges, They typically hit you fast, and they're usually for specific foods, especially carbs. And here's the fascinating part. When you're experiencing cravings, it's often a sign that your body's having some issues with insulin.
Wow, and what about addiction? That sounds pretty serious.
It absolutely is. Food addiction, particularly to carbohydrates, is it's when you've lost control over your eating habits. You might find yourself thinking about food constantly, eating even when you're full, and feeling guilty afterward, but still unable to stop.
So how can our listeners figure out which one they're experiencing?
Here's a practical way to think about it. When you feel like eating, ask yourself, is this a gradual physical need that any nutritious food would satisfy? That's true hunger. Or is it a sudden urge for something specific like pasta or cookies? That's likely a craving. And if you find yourself eating despite feeling full, or you're constantly preoccupied with thoughts of food, that might indicate an addiction pattern, which often suggests both insulin and leptin resistance are at play.
Speaking of insulin and leptin, can you tell us more about these hormones? They seem really important for understanding weight management.
Absolutely. These two hormones are they're basically the conductors of your body's metabolic orchestra, right? Let me break this down for you. Insulin is, and this is fascinating, it's kind of like your body's storage hormone. When you eat, your pancreas releases insulin to help your cells take in glucose from your bloodstream. It's also responsible for storing excess energy as fat.
Oh, so that's how it affects our weight?
Yes, and here's the thing. Insulin doesn't work alone. It's got this partner called leptin, which is actually produced by your fat cells. Think of leptin as your body's natural appetite suppressant.
How does that work?
So, while insulin is handling blood sugar and energy storage, leptin, produced by your fat cells, is sending signals to your brain that you've had enough to eat. When you have sufficient fat stores, your fat cells release leptin, which travels to your brain and tells it, hey, we're good here. No need for more food right now. When these two hormones are working in harmony, insulin helps with energy storage, and leptin keeps your appetite in check, creating a balance that helps prevent overeating.
That's incredible. And what happens when they don't work together properly?
That's where things get really interesting. When these hormones aren't functioning correctly, it's imagine a thermostat that's giving wrong readings. Your body loses its ability to properly regulate food intake and energy storage.
Oh, wow. Now I can see why these hormones are so crucial for weight management.
Right. And you know what's really important to understand? The way we eat and live today can seriously impact how well these hormones function, like constant snacking, processed foods, lack of sleep. These can all disrupt this delicate hormonal balance.
So how does it affect the body when it starts to lose sensitivity to these hormones? Like, what's the difference between being sensitive to them and being resistant?
That's actually a really important question. Let me explain it this way. When you're insulin sensitive, your body's responding perfectly to insulin signals, and you usually don't gain weight easily. And when you're leptin sensitive, it's like your brain is really good at hearing those I'm full signals. When both of these are working together, you basically never gain excess weight.
Oh, but if the balance is off, how does it impact someone's health overall?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. You see, when you become insulin resistant, your body starts requiring more and more insulin to do the same job. Like, imagine having to shout instead of whisper to get someone's attention, right?
And I'm guessing that's not good?
No, it's not. And here's the thing, that when you're insulin resistant, you'll notice that you start craving foods, especially carbs. It's like your body's sending out distress signals. But it gets even more complicated when leptin resistance joins the party. When you're leptin resistant, your brain basically, it stops hearing those I'm full signals altogether, and you'll tend to gain weight no matter what.
That sounds really frustrating. So how can someone tell if they're resistant to these hormones?
There's actually a pretty simple way to start figuring this out. When you find yourself wanting to eat, ask yourself, am I truly hungry? Or am I experiencing cravings? Or could I be dealing with carb addiction? See, if you're eating because you're genuinely hungry and you're satisfied after a normal meal, you're probably insulin and leptin sensitive. But if you're constantly craving carbs, that's often a sign of insulin resistance. And if you feel like you can't control your eating, especially with carbs, that usually means both insulin and leptin resistance are at play.
Let me share an interesting case with our listeners. We recently heard about a 48-year-old woman who's been struggling with weight gain for about 10 years now. And despite trying basically everything to lose weight, nothing seemed to work. What really caught my attention was that even when she got really sick.
Oh yes, I remember this case. You see, about 2 years ago, she experienced severe diarrhea for 11 days. So severe that she actually ended up in the hospital.
And the weird thing is, even though she barely ate during that time, she didn't lose any weight. How is that even possible?
This is where insulin comes into play in a really fascinating way. See, in her case, and this happens more often than you might think, her liver was insulin resistant, but her fat cells were still insulin sensitive.
Oh, but what does that mean for her body?
Well, it means that even tiny amounts of food, like even the small amount she was eating while sick, would get converted into glucose and fat whenever insulin was present. Her body was basically, it was like a super efficient fat storage machine.
That sounds so frustrating for her.
It really is, because no matter what she did, whether she ate very little or exercised more, her body was programmed to store everything as fat. The key here is those insulin levels. When your liver is insulin resistant, it's like having a broken thermostat that keeps storing excess calories as fat, even when you're barely eating.
I can imagine how discouraging that must be, trying everything and still not seeing results.
Absolutely. And the thing is, this isn't rare. Many people are dealing with this exact same situation, and they don't understand why traditional weight loss methods aren't working for them. It's all about that underlying hormonal imbalance, right? You know what's really fascinating? This whole process actually reminds me of something we see in nature, specifically with grizzly bears.
Grizzly bears? How so?
Well, right before hibernation, grizzly bears go through this incredible metabolic transformation. See, their bodies naturally develop insulin resistance in their liver, and this is actually crucial for their survival.
That's so interesting, but why do they need that?
You see, this insulin resistance in their liver, it's like their body's way of preparing for winter. It helps them store massive amounts of fat really quickly. Their bodies become incredibly efficient at converting everything they eat into fat stores that'll keep them alive during hibernation.
Oh, and you're saying this is similar to what happens in some people?
Yes, like in some individuals, their bodies are stuck in this sort of, permanent pre-hibernation mode. Their liver becomes insulin resistant, just like the bears, you know what I mean? But the thing is, we're not supposed to hibernate.
That must make weight loss incredibly challenging.
Absolutely. And here's what makes it even more complicated. This metabolic pattern, it's actually a survival mechanism that worked perfectly for bears, right? But in humans, when this same process occurs, and when it's happening all year round, it leads to continuous weight gain.
So it's like their bodies are preparing for a winter that never comes?
That's actually a perfect way to put it. The body's just doing what it thinks it needs to do for survival, but in our modern environment, this ancient mechanism is basically working against us.
So what should our listeners really take away from all this?
Well, I think the most important thing is understanding your body's signals. Like when you're feeling hungry, pause and really ask yourself, is this true hunger, a craving, or something deeper?
And that can actually tell you something about your hormone balance, right?
Exactly. And remember, if you're constantly craving carbs, that's often a sign of insulin resistance. If you feel like you can't control those cravings, well, that might indicate both insulin and leptin resistance.
This has been such an eye-opening discussion. Before we wrap up, anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yes, just remember that weight management isn't simply about willpower, it's about understanding your body's hormonal balance. And if you're struggling, it's totally okay to seek professional help.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Everyday Health Stories. Thanks so much for breaking this down for us, Dr. Reddy.
My pleasure.
But before we go, I just want to remind our amazing listeners that this is all for informational purposes only. Make sure to check with your doctor about any health concerns.
And hey, take a moment to hit pause and subscribe to the podcast. You'll get notified of new episodes, gain access to exclusive content, and join a community that's making positive changes, one story at a time.
Very well said, Dr. Reddy. See you next time, everyone. Keep staying curious about your health and keep listening to our podcast. Remember, every story has the power to transform lives.
Take care, everyone, and we'll catch you in the next episode.